The contract said 1 year. It said no feelings. It said this marriage was strictly business. So why, on our wedding day, was the coldest man I had ever met, the man who was only marrying me to save my company, looking at me like I was the only thing in the room worth saving? Why would a billionaire agree to marry a total stranger just to save her company? What was he hiding behind that unreadable face of his? And how far were my enemies willing to go to destroy us before I ever found out the truth? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let me start from the beginning. My name is Vivian Hale, and 6 months ago I would have told you I didn't need saving by anyone. I ran Hale Textiles, my father's company, built from nothing, in a warehouse he financed with a loan he almost didn't get approved for. When he died, I was 24. Everyone told me to sell. Everyone told me a company like that needed a man's name on the door to survive. I kept it. I grew it. And for 4 years, I proved every single one of them wrong. I want you to understand something about me before I tell you what happened next. I didn't build a career so a man could come along and rescue it. I built it so nobody ever could take it from me again. But sometimes life doesn't ask what you're willing to accept. It just happens to you. It started small. A shipment delayed for no reason. A supplier who suddenly stopped returning calls. Numbers that didn't add up in a quarterly report that should have been clean. I told myself it was bad luck. It wasn't bad luck. It was sabotage. I just didn't know whose hands were on it yet. The board meeting where everything cracked open happened on a Tuesday. I remember because I'd worn my father's old cufflinks that morning, the ones I kept in my desk for days I needed to feel brave. My Uncle Gerald sat at the head of the table, like he already owned the room. "Vivian," he said, folding his hands the way he always did, before he said something he thought was reasonable and was actually a knife. "The company is bleeding. We have an offer on the table. A generous one." "From Victor Lang," I said. Not a question. Victor Lang had been circling Hale Textiles for a year, like he could smell the blood before I could even see the wound. Every acquisition he made, he gutted the company first, then wore its name like a trophy before he buried it completely. "He'll keep the name," Gerald said, like that was supposed to comfort me. "He'll keep some of the staff. He'll keep the ones he can't automate," I said. "And in 18 months, there'll be nothing of my father's left standing." I refused, in front of the entire board, and I watched Gerald's jaw tighten in a way that told me this wasn't over. It was just beginning. That same week, Preston Colt walked back into my life like he'd never left it. Preston was my fiancé once. 2 years ago, right before my father passed, he left when things got hard, walked out during the worst month of my life, and told me, and I remember this word for word, that he hadn't signed up to be second to a company. Now here he was in my office lobby, holding 2 coffees, smiling like none of that had happened. "I heard things are tight," he said. "I want to help." I didn't trust him. I want to be clear about that from the start. I never trusted Preston Colt again after the day he left. But desperation makes you listen to people you shouldn't. The final blow came on a Thursday afternoon. My phone rang, and it was the bank. The loan my father had taken out years ago, the one that had always been manageable, had been quietly sold to a new lender. A lender connected, I would later learn, to Victor Lang, and the new terms gave me 11 days to pay it in full, or the bank would seize the company's assets. 11 days, 240 employees, my father's name on the door. 11 days. That night, my best friend Meg sat across from me in my apartment with a bottle of wine we didn't finish, and she said, half joking, the way you joke when you don't know what else to say, "You need a miracle, Viv, or a billionaire husband." I laughed. God, I actually laughed. I had no idea that 4 days later, I would be sitting across from exactly that. The message came through my assistant on a Monday morning. A meeting request. No explanation. Just a name. Damian Kessler. I knew who he was, the way everyone in that world knew who he was. Kessler Industries. Old money turned into an empire twice its size under his control. I'd seen him exactly twice before, once at a gala, once at a summit, and both times, he'd said maybe 10 words total and left every room feeling colder and more interesting for his absence. I remember walking into his office and thinking, before he'd even said a word, that photographs did not do him justice. He had the kind of face that made you forget your train of thought mid-sentence. Sharp, composed, unreasonably handsome, in a way that felt almost unfair. And then he looked up at me, and I felt it immediately, the wariness. Because a man that quiet, that controlled, wasn't quiet because he had nothing to say. He was quiet because he was always 3 steps ahead of you. "Ms. Hale," he said, "sit down." I sat. He didn't offer coffee, didn't make small talk. He slid a folder across the desk. "I'm prepared to cover the full amount owed on your loan," he said. "Today, in writing." I stared at him, waiting for the catch, because there is always a catch with men like that. "In exchange for what?" "Marriage," he said, flat, like he was quoting a stock price. 1 year. A contract. Nothing more. I actually laughed out loud. The second time that week someone had said the word marriage to me, like it was a punchline. Except this time, the man across from me wasn't joking at all. "I don't need to be rescued," I told him. "I'm not rescuing you," he said. "I'm making an investment. You keep full operational control of your company. I get what I need from the arrangement. It's business, Ms. Hale. Nothing sentimental about it." I walked out of that office and told myself I'd never go back. 3 days later, Victor Lang forced an emergency board vote. Gerald, my own uncle, quietly supported it. I was 1 vote away from losing everything my father had built, and I had run out of options that didn't involve a stranger with unreadable eyes and a folder full of numbers that could save my life's work. So I went back. But I went back on my terms. "Full operational control stays with me," I said, sliding my own list of conditions across his desk. "No public displays unless required, separate residences within the house, and an exit clause. If either of us wants out early, we can end it with 30 days' notice." He read every line without a single change in his expression. Then he signed it without negotiating a single point. That unsettled me more than if he'd fought me on it. There was one moment, before the wedding, that I didn't understand until much later. It was raining outside his office building, hard, the kind of rain that soaks you in 10 seconds. I didn't have an umbrella. He came out behind me, didn't say a word, took off his jacket, and put it over my shoulders. Then he turned and walked to his car without waiting for a thank you. I stood there in the rain thinking, that is not what a business transaction looks like. Our wedding was small, quiet, a handful of witnesses, a courthouse dressed up to look like something grander than it was. I wore ivory because it seemed foolish to wear white for a marriage that wasn't real. And when I turned to face him at the altar, expecting the same unreadable, controlled expression he always wore, he wasn't looking at me like a business transaction at all. For 1 second, before he caught himself and the mask came back down, Damian Kessler looked at me like I was something he'd wanted for a very long time. I told myself I imagined it. I was wrong. Moving into his house felt like moving into a museum I wasn't allowed to touch anything in. It was beautiful and enormous and completely without warmth, until I started noticing the small things that didn't fit the cold, careful image he presented to the world. At a business dinner 2 weeks into the marriage, a rival investor made a comment about my company, called it a nice little hobby that got out of hand. I watched Damian's expression change for exactly 1 second, and then, without raising his voice, without even looking particularly bothered, he ended that man's evening. Hale Textiles turned a profit under Vivian's leadership in a market that buried 3 of your portfolio companies last year, he said. I'd choose my words more carefully if I were you. The table went silent. The investor didn't say another word to me all night. Nobody had defended me like that in a very long time. We didn't speak on the drive home, but when we got in, instead of disappearing to his wing of the house like he usually did, he stopped in the hallway outside my door. You didn't need me to say anything back there, he said. You would have handled him yourself. I would have, I agreed. That's not the point. For a second, something almost like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. It was gone as fast as it appeared. Good night, Vivian, he said, and left me standing there wondering why my heart was doing something it had no business doing over 4 words. I found him in the kitchen a few nights later, well past midnight, when I couldn't sleep and went looking for water. He was standing at the counter in a plain gray t-shirt, no jacket, no armor, the most undone I'd ever seen him, reading something on his phone with a coffee he clearly wasn't planning to sleep after. "You're allowed to be in your own kitchen," he said, without looking up. "You know that, right?" "I keep forgetting it's mine too," I admitted. He poured a second cup without asking if I wanted one and slid it across the counter to me. "Black, no sugar," he remembered. Again, we ended up sitting at the counter for almost an hour that night, not talking about the company, not talking about the contract, just talking. He told me reluctantly that he used to play piano as a kid before his father decided it wasn't a useful use of his time. I told him about the year I spent trying to learn to sew on my father's factory floor and ruining an entire bolt of silk. He laughed, an actual laugh, low and surprised out of himself, like he hadn't expected to still know how. I went to bed that night thinking about how much easier it would be to keep hating him if he would just stop being so easy to like. A week after that, a storm knocked the power out across half the city. I was in the library trying to find candles when he appeared in the doorway with a flashlight and 2 glasses of wine, like he'd been waiting for an excuse. "Emergency protocol," he said, deadpan, and I laughed before I could stop myself. We sat on the floor in front of the dead fireplace, flashlight balanced between us, and for the first time since I'd married him, the silence between us didn't feel like distance. It felt comfortable, familiar, almost, in a way I couldn't explain for a man I'd known such a short time. At one point, the wind knocked something loose outside, and I flinched. He reached over, without thinking about it, and closed his hand over mine on the floor between us. He didn't say anything. He didn't pull away either. Neither did I. "You're not what I expected," I told him quietly, in the dark. "Neither are you," he said. "I expected you to hate me for the terms of that contract. You never did." "Give it time," I said, and he actually smiled. A real one, the kind I was starting to realize he rationed carefully, like he didn't trust himself to hand them out. We stayed like that, hands together on the floor of a dark library, until the power came back on and the moment ended before either of us had to decide what it meant. Then there were the details, small ones. He knew I took my coffee black, no sugar, which I had never told him. He knew I hated the color gold, which was in exactly none of our public wedding photos, though I'd never mentioned it once. Little things a man shouldn't know about a stranger he married for business. I started to wonder how much of this marriage was actually strategy, and how much of it was something he wasn't telling me. Not everyone in his world welcomed me, though. His cousin, Isadora Kessler, made that clear within the first week. "You do understand," she said to me at a family function, smiling with her mouth and nothing else, "that men like Damian don't marry for love. He'll tire of this little arrangement eventually. They always do." I told myself I didn't care what she thought. I was lying to myself, a little. Preston resurfaced again around that time too, showing up outside my office building with that same practiced concern on his face. "I'm worried about you," he said. "A man like that, marrying that fast? Vivian, are you sure he's not just using you to get something from your company? You should tell me what you know about his contracts. I still have connections. I could help you protect yourself." I didn't tell him anything. Some part of me had already learned that lesson once, but the pressure on both sides was building. Behind the scenes, though I didn't know it yet, Gerald and Victor Lang had pivoted their entire plan. Blocked from taking my company directly, they turned their attention toward destabilizing Kessler Industries instead, hoping to collapse both empires at once and pick through the wreckage. I found out by accident that Damian had personally wired funds to one of my struggling suppliers, keeping them from going under, without telling me and without asking for credit. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked him. "It wasn't necessary," he said, and went back to his paperwork like the conversation was over. It wasn't the answer of a man protecting an investment. It was the answer of a man who didn't want to be thanked. The moment that cracked something open between us happened at a charity gala we were required to attend as a couple. The room expected a performance, the perfect billionaire and his wife, and for one song, dancing close enough that I could feel how careful he was being with his hands, careful in a way that felt like restraint, not distance. I stopped performing. I looked up at him, and for a second neither of us said anything. His eyes dropped to my mouth. Mine did the same to his. Someone's camera flashed nearby, and the moment broke before either of us could decide what we were about to do. I lay awake that night thinking about a man I still didn't fully trust, and realizing, with something close to panic, that I wanted to. The story broke on a Wednesday morning, and by the time I saw it, it had already spread everywhere. Hale Textile's CEO married Billionaire to save company. Sources say marriage was a financial scheme from the start. Isadora's fingerprints were all over it, though it took me time to piece that together. The article was timed perfectly, right when Hale Textile's recovery was finally gaining public confidence, right when investors were starting to trust me again. The damage was immediate. 2 suppliers pulled back. A retail partner paused a contract, pending clarity on leadership stability. At the same time, I learned my Uncle Gerald had quietly signed his shares over to Victor Lang, giving him a controlling stake in the company from the inside, my own family. And then I learned the worst part. Preston hadn't reappeared out of concern for me at all. He'd been feeding information to Victor Lang the entire time, positioning himself to rescue me the moment my marriage collapsed and my company went down with it. I felt like the ground had opened underneath me. I confronted Damian that night, furious, hurt, certain that somehow all of this traced back to him, that the wedding, the timing, all of it had been a calculated business move to make his empire look untouchable, while mine burned in the process. "Did you know this would happen?" I demanded. He didn't answer right away, which felt, in that moment, like confirmation. I told him I wanted out. I told him to use the exit clause. I told him I never should have trusted a man who agreed to marry a stranger without asking a single question about why. That's when I found out what he'd actually been doing behind my back for weeks. Meg came to me first, quiet and serious in a way she never was. "Viv," she said, "he's been fighting Lang this entire time. Buying up debt Lang was using as leverage against you, blocking 3 separate attempts to force a hostile board vote. He never told you because he didn't want it to look like you owed him anything." Before I could process that, one final blow landed. A document surfaced, leaked, supposedly from inside Kessler Industries, outlining Damian's original intention to end the marriage exactly at the 1-year mark and walk away with a significant financial advantage from the deal, no different than he'd always planned. I didn't know yet that Isadora had forged it. All I knew, in that moment, standing in his study with that piece of paper in my hand, was that I'd let myself fall for a man I still didn't fully understand, and I was terrified I'd been a fool twice in one lifetime. "Tell me the truth," I said. "Was any of this ever real?" For the first time since I'd met him, Damian Kessler looked like a man who didn't know how to stay quiet anymore. "You want to know why I really married you?" he said, his voice low, rougher than I'd ever heard it. And then, before he could say another word, my phone rang. Board emergency. Lang was making his final move. I left. And I didn't know, walking out that door, whether I was walking away from the truth or straight toward it. I found out the rest of it 2 days later, sitting across from him in that same study, both of us exhausted, both of us finally out of reasons to keep pretending. He told me everything. 2 years before we ever spoke, Damian had watched me at a business summit. Young, outnumbered, fighting off 3 men twice my size and influence, who all but told me to my face that Hale Textiles would be better off in someone else's hands. He said he remembered exactly what I said back to them. He never approached me. He told me later that he respected my independence too much to insert himself into it uninvited. That a man like him, with his name and his money, could tilt any room he walked into, and he didn't want to be another person deciding my company's fate for me. But he never stopped noticing me either. 2 years of quiet, distant admiration, never acted on, because he told himself it wasn't his place. Then he heard, through the same networks that eventually told him everything, that Hale Textiles was collapsing, that Gerald and Lang were closing in, that I had days left before I lost everything my father built. "I didn't propose a contract because it was strategic," he said. "I proposed it because it was the only way I could protect you without you ever having to owe me for it. If I'd have offered you the money outright, you would have refused it. I know you well enough to know that. The wiring of funds to my suppliers. The quiet blocking of Lang's takeover attempts. The defending of my company at that dinner, without hesitation, without me even asking, none of it had been about protecting an investment. It had been about protecting me. The document, I said. The one that said you planned to leave at the 1-year mark. Forged, he said. Isadora's doing. She's wanted control of my company for years, and she saw you as the one thing standing in her way of ever getting close enough to take it. Because for the first time, I actually cared about someone more than I cared about winning. I sat with that for a long moment. The coldest, quietest man I had ever met, and every single thing he'd never said out loud had somehow still made itself known. In a jacket over my shoulders in the rain, in a coffee order he shouldn't have known, in a hand steady with restraint on a dance floor. The contract was real, he said finally, quieter now. But my feelings were never part of the deal, Vivian. They were the reason for it. I want to tell you I had some clever response ready. I didn't. I just reached across the space between us, and for the first time since the day I'd met him, neither of us pulled away. We walked into that final board meeting together, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, it didn't feel like I was fighting alone. We laid it all out in front of the board, the investors, and Victor Lang himself. The forged document traced back to Isadora's private server. Preston's messages to Lang, handed over by Meg, who'd been quietly gathering proof for weeks without telling me, worried I'd shut her down out of pride. Gerald's shares, signed over under a side agreement designed to gut the company he claimed to love. Victor Lang's face went white as the room turned on him in real time. His own investors, unwilling to be associated with fraud, began pulling out before the meeting had even ended. Gerald was removed from the board that same afternoon. Preston's reputation, what little of it remained, didn't survive the week. Isadora was quietly and permanently cut off from the family she'd tried so hard to control. Hale Textiles didn't just survive. It came out of that year stronger than it had ever been, not because a billionaire had rescued it, but because, in the end, we'd fought for it together. Weeks later, on a quiet evening with none of the noise from that world around us, Damian asked me to stay. Not because of a contract, not because of an exit clause or a business arrangement or anything written on paper, just because he wanted me to. I want to leave you with this. The contract said 1 year. It said no feelings. But some of the best things in my life were never part of any plan I made. I didn't marry him to fall in love. I married him to save my company. I just didn't expect that somewhere along the way, he'd end up saving me too.